George Schweifelder.
Yeah, okay.
Good morning, Jim.
Morning, everybody. Sounds like we're recording, David, if you want to just get started.
Yeah, I don't know if we give it a couple minutes, Tim, 9:05, or you want to start?
Is George with us?
Not yet, but I can text him.
I think he's our
Yep.
our main attraction here, right?
See Matt Pollock just.
Yeah, Matt is on.
All right, I just texted him. What, is there anything else? I forget that we had to cover. This is predominantly what it was, I think.
Yeah, I think today was just to have a conversation with George.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess, I mean, he can tell you exactly what he's doing, but at this point, he's working still for the test center. He's working, he does research. He was the head of Department of Health and the Environment for Cape Cod for many years. He's the one who started the Mass Test Center up. So George has as much experience as anyone, I would say, in the world with AT technologies or any technology for that matter, with respect to on-site wastewater treatment. He's heavily involved. I don't know if I wouldn't say he's running it now. There's other people, Brian and Sarah help run the test center for him, but he's still heavily involved in it. Including there's this EPA Shubal Pond project where they basically set monitoring wells with USGS and it's a small watershed that flows towards a pond. So they outfitted that watershed with monitoring wells to have an understanding that if they put in nitrogen removal technologies, how that might in the real world affect the change. More or less, they were able to calibrate the models that they had on Cape Cod.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another project that's ongoing, I still believe. But
So would it be worthwhile for us while we're waiting for George, and maybe you guys have already done this in your own minds, or together with you and Stu, David, but should we be contemplating what questions we want to ask George that would help us answer any of those sort of questions that we need to have answered in order for us to make the decisions that we need to make or the recommendations that we need to make to the larger working group. So I imagine you have, it looks like George is.
Here's George. Good morning, George.
Good morning.
Mm-hmm.
You hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, good.
Would it be worthwhile, David, to do a brief round of introductions just so George knows who he's talking with?
Sure, that makes sense. Well, so Dave Potts with Geomatrix and Stu's here with me.
Yep, Stu Fairbank, Angus McDonald, Gary Shorter and Associates.
Hi, George. I'm Jim Paris. I am the CEO of the Home Builders and Remodelers Association of Connecticut.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, George. I'm Greg Mattis. I'm a sanitarian with a local health department in Old Saybrook, shoreline communities, Clinton, Old Saybrook, Haddam, Deep River.
Good to meet you.
So David, why don't you, for the record, tell George why we're here and maybe kind of get us started with maybe some, some 30,000 foot kind of questions that we could start with.
Let's keep going. Just before that, Jim, let's go. How about you, Matt?
Yeah. I'm sorry, guys. I was able to attend this meeting. I wasn't originally able to do so, but I'm here now. So Matt Pollock here. program supervisor at the Department of Public Health.
Good morning, Audra Dixon, Director of Water Permitting Enforcement Division for DEEP.
Well, thank you all. Thanks, George, for jumping on this call. We appreciate it. Really, this group, the goal of this group is to figure out what nitrogen rules would be advisable for the state from both an environmental perspective, a health perspective, but balancing that against the costs for housing, because our housing costs have been going up and up. I think there's an interest in certainly protecting the environment and health, but there's also a recognition that there needs to be, some balance and some value that comes out of that. If we're spending significant dollars on that and not receiving any value, that doesn't make much sense from a housing perspective. And when housing costs go through the roof and people's housing options are limited, that's got health issues as well. So I think generally that's the mission this group has. And I think we're curious how Massachusetts has done it. And I would say even more so how you might do it, recognizing that maybe Mass doesn't do it. What improvements could be made as realized over the past 10 years when the regulations were put in effect in many instances long ago.
Okay. Want me to go?
Sure, you go, and maybe a little introduction. I tried to do it, but I probably got it wrong, so you might want to clarify what you
Okay.
do now and what you used to do.
Okay, George Hoyfelder. I used to be the director of the Barnstable County Department of Health and Environment. We have jurisdiction on the entire Cape Cod, 15 towns, and also the director here at MASTEC, the Massachusetts Alternative Septic System Test Center. And I'm also on a board of health. I serve on a board of health, and we are probably the epicenter in Falmouth of the nitrogen mitigation measures that the state is imposing, because we have 14 watersheds that have TMDLs already established, and hence we're under the gun to meet those TMDLs, or if another way to put it was not to exceed the TMDLs. And so Massachusetts years ago started to do some monitoring in their embayments and starting to develop watershed models. And the watershed models in Massachusetts have two bases. One is that calculating how much nitrogen is coming in to the embayment. And the other one is to measure out in the environment. There was a lot of surface water monitoring in the embayments to sort of ground truth, to sort of link those two. It's considered a linked model, that being that it not only deals with what's on the land side, but has its validation on the monitoring that's occurred on the water side. It isn't as, when I say linked, everybody thinks, okay, if you pull on this string, that other string shortens. It's not quite like that. There are a lot of assumptions to the models. Those proceeded from some data we generated here at MASTEC, but they also generate from some field studies that were done at SMAST, or Southeastern Massachusetts University, or really the marine science group down there under Dr. Brian Howes. So right now, our state, the Commonwealth, has invested so much in that modeling that they're a little bit hesitant to sort of back away from it. Dave, you asked if I were to do things differently. I think I would have had more vetting of the modeling that was done, because every time you say, well, we have to remove 20 pounds of nitrogen over here, there's a cost to it. And unless you're just totally dead sure that that 20 pounds there is going to mean something in the embayment, which is a negative impact. Unless you're dead sure of that, you know, you have to balance the uncertainties of the modeling with, you know, what is reality and what you can afford. So my mother always said, speak to what I know. I don't know modeling. To me, it's a big spreadsheet, which is like I say, you got a string here and you pull one side and the other side shortens. There's a direct impact, but I believe our modeling isn't that direct of an impact. There are a lot of uncertainties. How long the string is in between, you know, how much can you pull? If you pull there, does it really shorten up that much on the other side? That kind of thing, as far as an analogy goes. So what we do know here and what we focused on here is trying to find what alternative septic systems, particularly alternative on-site systems, and to some extent larger technologies, how they work and what they really do remove. That is a blessing and a curse, because in the early days of IE systems, you really couldn't measure influent values because as some of the folks out in Colorado realized, that since you have a recirculating system generally to achieve denitrification, you take nitrified effluent or some nitrified effluent and you bring it back to your headworks where you're mixing it with the fresh or raw wastewater coming in. You never can get a good number of what your influent value is unless you got ahead of the septic tank, ground it all up as it was coming in and figured out what the real influent number is. With that uncertainty, what our state did, the Commonwealth did, is just established an effluent standard and made some assumptions about those effluent standards from our alternative septic systems. They would say, okay, if you get 19 milligrams per liter out the tail end of the system, that should equal about 50% removal. Now, we have since, as the years went by and the technologies changed, where a lot of the technologies, particularly on the on-site systems, did not use recirculation as a means of achieving carbon source for denitrification or in their process. Let's say we can measure, for instance, on the two leading technologies in the Commonwealth here, we can get the septic tank effluent. We know what it is. And it's certainly not the 40 milligrams per liter that is generally accepted within the modeling efforts of the Commonwealth as being your influent number. We see very similar to what they found in Colorado with Segrist work. I mean, it wasn't Segrist, but under his tutelage, that 60 even is a low number. For instance, we have a very large project now where we have about 20 systems out there in Shubal Pond, and we measure the influent yearly, monthly for a year. I mean, the average is up around 80. So we know that if you got 19 and you had 80 going in, that's 75% removal plus. So fundamentally, I think a mistake that might have been made here in the Commonwealth, and this is not a reflection of the opinion of the department or MassTech or anybody else. My mother would even tell me, I don't know what I'm talking about. But I would say if they made a fundamental mistake, they didn't really accommodate being able to actually give a load reduction number. Because if they just assume that 19 milligrams per liter is 50% removal, they don't know what the load reduction from that house is. And now they're caught between a rock and a hard place because they say, okay, this watershed has to remove 7,000 kilograms a year in order to meet the TMDL or not to exceed the TMDL. Then there are technologies where you could say, okay, at this house you reduce 50, at this house you reduce 60, this house you reduced 80, because we can measure influent effluent and the water use. I mean, the technology has gotten to the point where all water departments, for instance, use something like a Neptune meter, where they don't come to your house anymore and read the meter. They drive by your house and collect the data. And so we've been using that. The other sort of technology increases, we of course can measure the influent, and we measure the effluent, and we get the volume, so you could do a load reduction right there. It would also accommodate things like urine diversion. We're looking at that in our town, urine diversion. And you know, you might squint at that and say, well, that's kind of ridiculous, but you know, the majority of the nutrients come from urine. So if you could divert that and treat it somehow or divert it out of the watershed, you'd have meaningful reductions. Well, unfortunately, the modeling efforts in the Commonwealth here don't allow for that. You can't say, well, I removed 7,000 pounds right there of nitrogen just in the urine. Well, that doesn't fit into their modeling scheme. So there is a slow shift to try to figure out how to meld the two concepts, actual load reductions versus concentration of whatever, concentration of nutrients from a septic system. But those efforts, I mean, we're pushing uphill for those efforts. So here at Mastec, I think you probably know we just test technologies. We know what the influent is because we measure it every day, and we know what the effluent is. We measure it whenever the client wants to, or if they're in a standard test like NSF standard 245 or B&Q standard or any standard a state might have, or ETV or ETI. Those standards we measure however the client wants to do it. If they want to go through NSF, that's pretty extensive protocol, but it only goes 6 months.
Yeah.
So,
Hey,
you know,
George.
yeah, go.
Audra has her hand up. You want to take a question now?
Sure,
We don't get
anytime.
too far out of the area. Thanks.
Nope.
Go ahead,
No,
Audra.
thank you very much. I just wanted to get clarification when you talk about the model and the TMDL. When you say the model didn't take into account certain considerations, which I'm not surprised, are you referring to the modeling that was done to support the TMDL?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So that was
And
part
the-
of how the TMDL was developed. And so the TMDL document doesn't take into account a load reduction. Is that what you're saying?
Correct, not in the instance of wastewater.
Got
And
it.
that is to me kind of a strange thing because in the model, and DEP has allowed certain sort of standard reductions. For instance, if a town puts fertilizer restrictions in place, or if they're growing shellfish at the discharge where it comes into the estuary, if they're growing shellfish and harvest them. So we don't think it's a big leap to start looking at wastewater and saying influent in, effluent out, difference times the volume is your load reduction. But they have
Sure.
not come to that point yet.
Okay. No, that's helpful because a lot of TMDLs are written with like a straight, you must meet this number by this date, right? And don't take into account those variables. Do you know who funded the modeling efforts?
Yeah, the Massachusetts, the Commonwealth, as well as EPA.
Okay. So
Those
joint effort.
efforts, yes, there was an extensive monitoring out in the embayments. There are what are called sentinel stations. And the model would predict that if you reduce here, that sentinel station should go down by this much. And they ground truth those models based on that. But there hasn't been a whole lot of the ground truthing going on because there was, okay, this is the load in the embayment. Here's what that sentinel station says. We sort of feel like if you reduced half in the watershed, you get X reduction out in that embayment at that sentinel station. And that's what they're focused on. They established a number of sentinel stations. And I say sentinel but they're probably what they assumed they were good characteristic indicators of general overall environmental health out there, or the health of the ecology. And they established the number they need to get. And they then worked backwards, looked at what the loading was, and through their gyrations, probably formulas that are way above my head, they said, well, if we take a third away from here, we'll get this number at that Sentinel station.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. Thank you for that.
Yeah, in general, the concentrations they're looking for out there, like depending on the bathymetry of the embayment, like we
Right.
on our side in Falmouth, we only have a 2 foot, 2.5 foot tide. So there's not a whole lot of exchange, but they're looking for concentrations like 0.35 or 0.4 milligrams per liter total nitrogen.
Okay, and this is a tidally influenced area?
Yeah, these are all tidally influenced embayments.
Okay.
So on the other side of the Cape, you have 9 foot tide. So some of their TMDLs, you don't see many of them established there yet. Wellfleet would be probably the closest, but they have some choke points that even though they have a 9 foot tide, it doesn't always get up to where the impacts are felt.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right,
Any other-
thanks, Audra. So what is the group, do we want to discuss different technologies? Do we want to discuss the general theory on how nitrogen is? So we have a little different situation than Cape Cod here, George. You know, we have deep rock aquifers in much of the state. We have Long Island Sound. We don't have quite the embayments you have on Cape Cod. And one of the I guess our decisions or to make a recommendation would be, how do we handle I'll say the upland areas that might be less nitrogen sensitive, and I say might, versus the coastal areas that might be more environmentally sensitive?
Well, the first thing is to establish the whole concept of watershed, the watershed that feeds into that water that's being impacted.
Yes.
And in our area, sandy soils, it's pretty easy. The watershed generally follows the topographic watershed plus some, because in Cape Cod, you put a drop of water here, eventually it's going to get to the ocean. But where it comes out, does it come out in Vineyard Sound? Does it come out in Buzzards Bay? Does it come out, in the North Atlantic somewhere?
Yeah.
So, so the watershed establishment is key. If I put a drop of water here, if I put a drop of wastewater here, where will it emerge? Will it emerge in an area that is now impacted? Then you have to say, and which the modeling does do some of this, say, what is the attenuation? The natural attenuation, for instance, in our models, if the up gradient of a freshwater pond, there is nitrogen input, they know the down gradient of that pond, because we have kettle hole ponds, then that nutrient is going to be drastically reduced as it passes through the aquifer and then into the etheric zone, or never could pronounce that word, the zone of mud and stuff at the bottom of the pond, in which it denitrifies, because that's an anoxic zone. So we generally, and you know this better than most, Dave, about 18 inches of our sand, you nitrify everything at our loading rates, which are 0.74 gallons per square foot per day, or 3 centimeter height. Yeah, so we get rapid nitrification. So our attenuations are either dilution or denitrification in the water.
Yeah.
Or unless you've denitrified before you discharged it to the leach field. Our leach fields get anywhere between 20 to 30% removal in sand. And if you believe the literature, and there's a vast amount of this, particularly from the Chesapeake, where they looked at all the different soil types, you got a different soil type, there probably should be a different attenuation factor if it's discharged, depending of course on the soil type, obviously, but then the loading rate. Because if you load our soils real heavy, you might not get as much denitrification, or you might get even more. You just don't know. The
Yeah, no,
main thing for public health and the main establishment of this vertical setbacks from groundwater and public health are not nutrients, they're pathogens. So we figure you need at least a 4 to 5 log reduction, and that's achieved in our sand at about 4 feet.
yeah. Yeah, on our soils here, certainly, I mean, a little different than Cape Cod, but I think we've got situations where we have ledge going right into the Long Island Sound, and, you know, presumably with a lot of development on that, you might get one result. And we've seen other
Yes.
situations with tremendously high loads of nitrogen, you know, seem to disappear as it hits the Sound. It must be anoxic zones, maybe it's organic, old swamp, you know, wetland areas. Something removes it. So
Yeah.
definitely that watershed approach is important in figuring out where do you invest in nitrogen removal and where might you not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Commonwealth has always taken an extreme conservative approach that you'll get certain reduction in your leach field, and then they're very careful with their attenuation factors. But you know, I should say too that at the beginning of the model construction, Dr. Howes and his group down at SMAS, they did receive a lot of funding. They did compile a lot of research, but the research that was compiled and synthesized and resulted in the model is not without controversy. There is some world-class controversy there. It's not like, you know, Joe Schmo came out of the closet and said, this doesn't work here. You had folks like Ivan Valiella, who is well known, his work is respected. They use a lot in the Chesapeake. They talk about it in the Florida research. And he used to say, no, there's a lot more attenuation before it gets to the embayment. And he had a setback of a certain distance, and I forget what that was. He said pretty much everything deposited upgrading that gets denitrified before it hits the embayment. That particular piece is rarely mentioned and was discarded from at least the Commonwealth's modeling approach. And it's interesting that Brian Howes was a student of Dr. Valliella's, but but the approach was different. And I think the Commonwealth's in for a nickel and for a dime at this point. So now it's just trying to work for us, because Falmouth is really under the gun. We're trying to work the edges of that model and say, you know, let's work at this assumption here. I mean, urine diversion is a clear example of it. I mean, you take 20,000 gallons of urine out of a watershed. One, you can measure it. You can say, okay, here's the concentration, here's the volume, here's what we're hauling on those 2 trucks.
Yeah.
So that's not a guess. That has no assumptions.
Yeah.
So we're trying to figure out, how do you work this in? Because there are people who can't afford these IE systems that would say, yeah, if I had a diversion toilet and I could get this credit for it, I'd go that way. It'd save water, it'd save, you know, a lot of angst, and it would get out of the watershed some nutrients. And now there are companies making fertilizer out of it. They're turning it into struvite.
So maybe you're on the cost side of it. Maybe we could discuss a little bit about the nitrogen technologies, how that shifted in the Commonwealth over time, and you know, where the direction you're headed now with some of those, because a lot of those, I mean, I've watched how there have been a lot of technologies out there. I don't know, hundreds, there's certainly 100 technologies out there that remove nitrogen, you know, in the world for on-site systems. ranging from, and people have talked about the cost here and the cost in Rhode Island, something like $30,000 to get the nitrogen removal system up in the ground and running. What, do you have a sense what your total price is for, I'll say ones that work well, and maybe you could discuss how you've shifted towards what works well versus
Yeah.
what's not so well proven?
The shift first, I'll talk about that. As anybody on site wastewater knows that, 40 years ago, nitrogen was not the issue. It just wasn't. So a lot of technologies developed primarily to reduce leach field sizes so they could get rid of BOD and TSS, reduce the leach field size, push it into the ground. Well, when nitrogen came along, a lot of those technologies simply said, oh, okay, well, we reduce some nitrogen, but if we recycle this stuff, maybe we'll get more. Because after you're done treating secondary, you generally don't have a whole lot of BOD left, so that can't drive denitrification. So let's take some of that and put it back in the septic tank, or let's put it back into a settling basin where it's anoxic. Those systems, very simple fix, very simple retrofit or engineering fix, could reduce nitrogen somewhere around 50%, if that. And they sold them then as denitrification units. Well, just about that time, the early 90s, that's when Massachusetts started saying, gee, we got to worry about nitrogen. So they started coming into the state. The state didn't really know what to do with it. We're in our code change in 1995. They wanted to accommodate nitrogen removal and alternative systems for both leach field reductions and nitrogen reduction. So what they did was they approved a bunch of them conditionally. And they had two general use approval systems. One, tried and true, recirculating sand filter, and they gave that a certain credit. Then there was another system because they couldn't require these in nitrogen sensitive areas, which by the time were only water resource protection, drinking water resource protection areas. They had to come up with a credit to allow people to build in these areas, some reduction, so that they wouldn't push the drinking water well over 10 milligrams per liter. Actually, their target was 5. So those technologies are still out there, and they gain general use approval for those nitrogen sensitive areas, that being the nitrogen sensitive areas that were related to drinking water. And they were given probably a pretty conservative credit, like you can put 6 bedrooms on an acre here if you have it. If you don't have an IA, you put 4 bedrooms an acre for a general use system. So they were given some credit, and everybody thought, oh, these are general use, they remove nitrogen, that's great. That whole scheme was based on the fact that a landmass could take so much nitrogen, and at the edge of that landmass, 1 acre, you would reduce nitrogen from a household system down to less than 10 milligrams per liter, which is the drinking water standard. So initially, all the houses down here who had wells are automatically defined as a nitrogen sensitive lot. And they said, gee, I want to build 4 bedrooms on this half acre. And they couldn't do it. With an IA system, they could put 3. And they say, well, if that's all we can get, that's what we get. So the take home of that particular little sideline is that most of our IA systems in general use today didn't require a whole lot of nitrogen removal, got a certain credit, but they got the magic word general use approval. Now enter the more strict standards required in watershed areas serving marine environments, discharging to marine environments through the groundwater. Now you're talking about, oh man, 50% removal is nothing. You have to go much higher than that. In fact, most of our watersheds in Falmouth, you have to remove 90% to 100% of the nitrogen load that's in there right now. So you're certainly not going to do it with an alternative septic system. You got to get the water out of the watershed. So now with the stricter standards, the new technologies came along. A lot of those are wood-based or cellulose-based denitrification systems. The Nitro, the Nitrex, the two most best performers in our state right now. They both use lignocellulose as a carbon source. It's sustainable. They hope it lasts forever. If it doesn't, it can be changed out. But it's targeting sort of 20 years of use without having to do that. Many of them say it'll go long beyond that, and I wouldn't doubt that it would, because you fill 1,000-gallon tank or 1,500-gallon tank with wood chips. That is a lot of carbon, and it doesn't only rely on that carbon, but the biology that develops in there and then dies and lives and just recycles its own carbon while it's denitrifying or changing nitrate to nitrogen gas. So we have two technologies which our state has established, which called a banner, best available nitrogen removal technology. They took the best of those other systems, which I think the Advantex and Septitech were originally the top two. Then on the provisional side of thing, provisional use approval, they had the two best performing systems because they don't have general use. They have provisional use, that being the Nitrex and the Nitro systems. And now in Falmouth, we're looking at only allowing ones that get less than 10 milligrams per liter. We know that even
And
that,
how many of those? That's two?
that's only two.
Yeah.
Or
And could you explain a little bit how you have your database, how all the data, so that you're able to say that because you're tracking all the performance and ultimately can sum it down to there's two technologies. I mean, the world they don't think that way. The world hears every AT technology is great, it's going to solve all the problems, but your data is pretty convincing.
Yeah, we go back to, mid 90s where we started collecting data from all of these systems. And we established a system where an operator must report all results. We went around to every board of health. And again, we're unique in that we are a county health department. So we have jurisdiction by permission from every board of health. We can go into the town and enforce regulations if they invite us in. And we basically said, when they started putting these in for nitrogen removal in drinking water areas, wells, as well as marine systems, we said, look, if you let us, we will track all of those systems, data, performance, whether they're getting inspected, who's doing it, how frequently, all in accordance with their permit through DEP, because we permit technologies through the state. They approve them through the state, but they're permitted locally. So the state gives an approval list. They say, these are all general use approval. You can use anyone here. The local municipalities can establish stricter standards. One of those standards was not only if you put one in, will you promise to maintain it, we're going to require that you report to the county health department when you do that and all of the results of your required monitoring. So we have I think 66,000 data points from all of the different technologies, and we track them. They come in daily. We report those on the web. So anybody could go through and find out a technology, how it's working in their town if they wanted to. And that site is being updated, but it's still functional to get that information. On the back side of that, the guy you see in the camera now, as well as others, we have access directly to those data in a lot deeper form. Like we take those data when we and we're assisting the state at doing this too. We take those data and run it through a filter. And the filter is like, oh, you didn't report nitrate that day. You're told nitrogen, you reported just as TKN. Or, gee, you didn't take this. Or, isn't it strange that 4 of your samples on the same date at different locations all report the same number down to the second decimal point? Those get discarded or investigated, but mostly discarded for analysis. And then there's a number of different triggers. We start to know the operators because we can filter out and say, all of the systems in non-compliance, give me the operators, and we can figure out which operators, bad operators. So that system of just watching it has done a lot, because when we publish our results online, when people can access them, the vendors come to us and say, hey, these things, you can't report those. They're not working. I said, well, it's not our data. It's data from your operators of your systems. So slowly but surely, they're pulling in the reins on their operators. The owners can have access to their data. And it's a system that we put in place here that they can go in. They actually get a grade, A, B, or C. And if they get a C, they call that operator and say, what the heck's going on? We also report to the boards of health each year, or if a board of health called me right now and said, I'd like to know how every, say, FAST system or Advantix in my town is working. About 20 minutes later, they'd have an email with a full graph of everyone, addresses, they name. I mean, we don't put addresses up online for the general public, but of course we have access to all of that. We ship it to the Board of Health. We say, these folks haven't done their required monitoring. And the Board of Health can do what they want.
You got a question?
Matt's got.
Oh,
Yeah.
Matt, you got a question?
Yeah, so George, real quick, what you were saying, tracking, is this every single system, or is this just a select few that you guys track? How does that work?
Every single system.
Okay, so you obviously have a database statewide, and then
no, countywide. There are other towns off Cape that have contracted with us to do this, so we do it for them.
Okay.
And I will say, just in case you say, wow, who pays for all of this? We charge the contractors who are doing the work a certain fee every year to report into the system. So that sustains itself. So they report into the system, and right next to me, the office next to me, there's somebody who goes through that daily and says, oh, Mr. Smith just dropped his contract with Jones Incorporated. So they let Mr. Smith know either by email or a letter saying you have to have somebody. It's in your approval letter from the state. And so it's a system that's really we look at as being absolutely necessary if you're going to require IA systems widespread.
So is that something that, I mean, we'd have to do that here, obviously, it's a first step. Is that something that would be adaptable, or we could get some access to that from as a state of Connecticut?
Sure.
So
absolutely.
My second question is, so I'm just looking way down into the weeds here. Like, what are the like, who do you take enforcement action? Let's say you have one that's in violation. Like, who do you go after? You mentioned the maintainer or the operator, or
it's the owner of the system ultimately.
Yes.
So here would be a typical scenario. I'm on a Board of Health. We do this all the time. We ask for a list of this department. We say, give me all the people who haven't done anything with their contract. So they let their contracts lapse. We get about 20 of them. We mail letters out and say, you need a contract. Period, end of story, you need one. And if you're in enforcement, and I have been all my professional life, you realize that it's only 5% you really have to chase down the hole. Most of them, they get a letter, they say, oh crap, somebody's watching me. I think I'll come in line. The 5% we say, okay, we say the owner, there's $250 a day fine for this. And it isn't our fine, it's the state's fine. This is a violation of Title V, which is a state regulation which the locals enforce. So we're just going to turn this over to the guys who really might chase it down. That'll get you down to about 1% of people are really going to come challenge it, go to court. But, it's pretty straightforward. The regulation's there. It's not our regulation. The state says you have to do it. We just happen to have a mechanism to find out when you don't. And the local board then would enforce it. So we get it to we issue them an order in accordance with our regulation. You have a right to a hearing, you have a right to do this, you have a right to plead your case. And then once we issue the fine, it's a done deal. So we've had very few that we've had to chase all the way down. Most of them respond to a unregistered letter. The registered letter filters down and gets us down to about 1%. And the 1%, we just have to, beat that horse up.
Okay. One other quick question for you. One of the things I liked about Suffolk County in Long Island was they almost put some of the onus on the operator in terms of that, for instance, or I shouldn't say operator, that they approved a series of technology.
Company owners, the technology owners.
And so they had something to the effect that if they had so many failures attributed, that they could be taken off the list. So they almost had an incentive to keep things going, to make sure that they're operating these things properly. I mean, is that something that you think would be necessary, or is a good thing, bad thing?
I think it's a good thing, but the biggest question I always have is it sustained? I mean, out of the gate, there's so many places said, oh yeah, we're going to make you do a 3-year contract as part of your price, has to be there, you have to maintain it. And if you fail in these next 3 years, that's fine. Now, I don't know whether Suffolk County continues after a certain period, but it's like anything else. We're humans. So if we know that nobody's going to be watching after 5 years of this stuff, guess what's going to happen? And we have definitely shown, because we've had IE systems up here since the mid-90s, we'll tell you that if you aren't watching them, they aren't working, period. End of story. So if you embed in your regulation and can appropriately follow up, and the follow-up means you have technology, that doesn't mean that somebody has to, sit in a closet somewhere and do 50 calculations to find out who's not working. The technology's there, you should be able to do it. If our reporting thing is good because it has a little tickler file. So I say, we haven't heard from Mrs. Smith and she's 6 months over. If it isn't like that, you're doomed. And I think and I can't say for sure what's happening in New York, out of the gate, yeah, they tag the manufacturer and say, if you don't get this, we're going to pull you off the list. But when does the monitoring stop? And, an appropriate long-term maintenance and monitoring is necessary. And I'm not saying we have it right here in the Commonwealth. We require, for instance, a general use system now, quarterly monitoring for 2 years, and then it can be reduced on request. But it never goes away.
Hey, Matt,
Never goes away.
The interesting thing is, with the database George has, it's basically shown there's 2 technologies that are consistently meeting these nitrogen levels. So if you're a homeowner, it behooves you to know that, because if you decide I'm going to go put in a cheaper technology, and look, there's ones that are fairly inexpensive. They drop in a septic tank. They don't even have a clarifier.
Yeah.
But the probability that you have to, if you're certain that there's an enforcement mechanism, you put that in, you're probably going to have to rip it out and put an entirely new one in for the same cost. So I think the manufacturers, speaking as one, you're heavily motivated to do a good job so that you can keep your market going, right? If you don't do that, you don't have a market. But the critical thing is getting the performance information. And as I said to you, I think It's very important for Connecticut, even when we're not dealing with nitrogen systems, with just regular on-site septic systems. We should publish if there's failure in less than, say, 10 years, or whatever number we want to throw out there, that should be on a list, right? That's important for the public to know and all of us to know in the industry and the regulatory environment.
Yeah.
So,
Well, we did it, and again, we have local boards of health, 350 of them. And my board of health, what we did was we made every engineer who submitted a plan have their client sign a piece of paper. That piece of paper, because what we're getting is people were coming in with system X, which we knew wasn't very good. And we would say to the engineer at the hearing, we'd say, why did you take that technology for your client? Well, this is one we're most familiar with, whatever. I said, did you make your client aware that we're in a nitrogen sensitive area that might require more performance? Well, no, and this one will make it. And I said, how do you know that? Well, it's been tested out at the test center. I said, no, that's interesting. When was that? they would sit there red-faced because they didn't know that I ran the test center, and we'd go back and forth until finally we put a piece of paper together that said, first of all, you sign a paper that says, you know you have an IA system in your backyard, you know it requires maintenance for the life of the system, you know that there's certain requirements, and you have been made aware of all of the technologies available in your situation and the performance of those. And the engineers would say, well, how the hell are we going to find that out? I said, all you have to do is make this phone call and ask. Well, you can go online. If you're not online, well, just come in and sit down and look at the computer screens we look at. But you have to make yourself aware, because what we're afraid of is homeowners who, in all good conscience, put in a system, and then somebody knocks on their door and says, I'm sorry, that's not a system that's going to make it in this area. You're going to have to get something better. And we didn't want that to happen. So if they do that now, they will at least have had a piece of paper. Were you made aware of these technologies? And they signed that they did. For a while, that was a little choppy, but it was the best thing we did, because made the homeowner aware not only of their responsibilities, but that we're in a tough situation, require better technologies than the average bear. And they were buying the average bear because it was the lowest cost.
Hey, George, this is Mark Lancor. Couple of questions I have for you. This is all interesting stuff. I mean, you've been through, I would say, probably got a few bullet holes in your back and everything else on all of this. Cost-wise, forget the reimbursements that you get. What is it costing to manage and to do what you're doing in terms of a annual budget, plus or minus?
I'd say it costs to run the program somewhere around $120,000, because a lot of it is automated. So
Right.
we have let's call an operator, somebody who's sitting watching that screen, seeing the data coming in, making phone calls when it doesn't come in, apprising the boards of health what's going on in their jurisdiction, answering questions from the public.
Right.
That is, as I said, that is paid for by the operators themselves, which have to pay a fee per client to report to our system. They pass that, of course, on to the client. So in essence, the client is paying $50 a year for having somebody watch over their own operator, making sure he or she is doing the
Right.
correct thing and the data are looking good.
Okay. So the other question, and I can see part of this, and it always comes down to enforcement, and being able to make sure these things are getting done. You're on and I say the fact that you're having an owner sign a document and then they have to do this for 2 or 5 or 10 years, whatever's in the agreement, is great. And it's also, by what you're talking, it's almost like it's an honor system when you think
Yeah.
of it. It's actually like an honor system. Although there is people watching, you're able to send out notices, that sort of thing. State of Connecticut, even with deep, I mean, things are done by a permit, formal permit, and done based on a renewal. So part of what they also do is on the larger scale systems are 2-year audits. They're required. That way they're keeping operators and everybody else. If there's a problem, it comes up. So on a smaller scale, even with the homeowners and the IA systems there, has there ever been thought, I mean, this thing should be forever, quite frankly, because you're dealing with technology, things fail, people change ownership, that whole sort of thing, and it's in real estate. Is there ever been thought in mass about where it's a renewal? Maybe it's 5 years.
It's a good question. It's a good question because outside of our jurisdiction and those towns that have signed on with us, it is an honor system. It usually only gets caught with a real estate transfer because all IA systems in the Commonwealth require that it be registered with the deed. And the deed document contains that statement that you shall keep in perpetuity a
Right.
contract for this. So otherwise, it's only going to get caught at real estate transfer. But if you start to think about watershed plans,
Right.
then DEP will, and we haven't seen them do this yet because there are no watershed plans approved for our town yet. They will require an accounting system. And we anticipate that anybody who's going to say you need to do this in that watershed was going to require some accounting. So, as I said, most of it is automatic. They don't report that sample. The computer program says, hey, Joe did not take a sample when they should have done it. And there's a phone call made. So there are a lot of phone calls made, but after a while, they realize if I skip, I'm going to get called.
Yeah, and
So-
then it goes to enforcement. I mean, and that's all together, but it's all, you look at legal beagles and how they can actually get to make sure that the program is always sustainable. And you always need that hammer. And
Yes, the hammer in our state is that our state DEP
right,
is the authority.
right,
And right in their regulation, $250 a day,
right,
every day out is a bit different. All you have to do is put that in bold in the notice that goes to them, the email, the letter. We want to help you avoid $250 a day. There are not many people down here, although there's probably a few would say, I could go a year easy. But most of them are going to say, we better get on the stick on this because it's, even if the local board doesn't enforce it, we generally, our local board enforces it. We'll say, this is a non-criminal citation. It turns criminal after 30 days, you didn't pay it. Most of them, I think we only had one in the past 10 years I've been on the board that went all the way to that extent. One. We've had probably, I'm going to say 200 people come before the board or that we've requested board appearances. We lose half of them once they say, oh no, I don't want to appear before the board, I'll pay it. Where do I sign up? And we give them the list of contractors who can do it. So initially, initially it's some homework. After a while, it's the 1 in 100 that you have to chase down that hole.
okay, great.
Hey, Greg, you good, Mark, on questions?
Yeah, no, I'm good on that. I'm good
All
on
right,
that.
thank you. How about Greg and then Audra? Greg, you ready? Mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Can you hear me
Gotcha.
now? Right. George, question for you. I think you mentioned earlier the initial cost of one of these systems was maybe around an average $30,000 initial cost to set up. That's a difficult number to relate to different types of setups when it comes to industrial, commercial, residential type setups. But in the residential realm, what are the ongoing costs associated with operating these systems when it comes to hiring a contractor, maybe media replacement, cellulose, electric? What's the impact on electric bill? Is it like running a 2,000-watt pool pump for some of these recirculating systems? Do you have any insight on that kind of
Well,
stuff?
if you've got a recirculating system, something like Advantex, you're not even coming close to that. You're probably taking about 1.5 to 2 kilowatt hours a day. So I'd say half your refrigerator. The one that the Nitro system is passive. So it has a very small air pump, like a 7th horsepower, just a piston pump. Doesn't generate a whole lot. It's just really nitrifying in that first portion with some limestone. You can configure it pretty passively, so you've only got that small air pump. The contractors, you might have to spend for a year, maybe a $500 to $600 a year, depending on how you do it. Like if we're going to, in our watersheds in Falmouth, we will probably establish a utility program that actually does it, and they'll get a fee that's very similar to what a sewer fee would be. You know, it would come to them just like a sewer bill, water sewer bill. So it's comparable in that regard to what you would pay for water sewer. The cost, of course, if you did the math on any of the systems, the sewer systems going in on Cape Cod today, you're well over $100,000 a house, well over for sewer. So
You're saying to hook a new house up to sewer?
yep. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I've done the simple math, as they say. Okay, in fact, there was one just recently. We're going to put 200 homes on it, and I did the math on that, and they're well over $100,000 a home for that.
Yeah.
Now, the difference is that if it's a sewer, generally the municipality is biting off a big piece of that. There's a betterment that they give you, but it's like a 70-30 betterment or 60-40. So they're picking up a lot of that cost.
Mm.
In other words, the taxpayer is. So what we're working on, in fact, I just had a meeting Monday on it, is as we develop our watershed plans for protection of watersheds, we are going to have to subsidize the installation of these systems because they're doing it for the general good, just like sewer hookups are for the general good, but they're bearing all the costs. So it's a social inequity that we definitely know in our watersheds we are going to have to tackle. We cannot say to Jane Smith, you have to pay $40,000 for that system to go in, where a guy down the street, because he's close and near a sewer line, he's not picking up that cost. He's just picking up a portion of that. He'll pay less than that to hook up to a sewer. So we know that there's a social inequity piece that we have to work out. That's math. That's how the public is going to take it. But when you think about it, there's areas of Cape Cod will never be sewered, but they're going to require nitrogen removal. So in those areas, we're working to subsidize it. Now, what I saw in New York, Long Island, and I mean, you can look at this yourself, they threw so much money at it that I would love to have been a contractor down there.
Wow.
I mean, they had subsidies from the county, subsidies from the state. They even worked on their, I think, their SRF monies, state revolving fund money, so that some of the installations, because we worked with Stony Brook University, and I would say, you know, what did it cost to put in that system? That was easily 2 to 3 times what it would be for our most expensive contractor up here.
Yeah.
Because they have, New York has, Stony Brook has 3 systems up here they're doing research on. And I just had to redo the top of one of them because we're trying a different technology type. And I had somebody in here for a day and sent them the bill. A contractor was in for a day, materials in the bill. And they said, "Did you make a mistake here?" "No, that's what it costs." Really? I mean, are we going to receive another bill? No. They could not believe what it cost here compared to what it cost to put in a system down there. And I think it was because the contractors, you see a big pocket, you try to go into it. So I think if you're going to do it, a subsidy of some portion of it is going to have to be necessary in context of a watershed plan. That I think the townspeople can understand. We have to remove the stuff from this watershed. We're going to sewer 1/3 of it because it's so densely populated. We can do nothing else. But we're going to require this in the rest of the watershed. And here's a fund that we're going to establish to do that. And it's got to be based on maybe income. Maybe it's based on, you know, maybe the town takes over the total management of it itself, just like they run a sewer plant, they have a truck that goes around. We have a truck here, the septic utility truck. They go around and service the units that we service. People pay us to do it.
George, one question is, and I probably missed this at the very beginning, is on your
Hey, Mark.
sampling program. Just one
Hey,
question.
Mark, let's let Audrey go, and then you'll be
Oh,
next.
I'm sorry. Yep.
Yep, no problem.
Okay.
Thanks, guys. No, this is interesting for sure to hear how this is all working out. You mentioned earlier that the operating cost per year for the program, I think I said was 120,000. What was the startup cost for the program?
Well, startup we did on 2 grants, something called MET, Mass Environmental Trust Grant. As soon as and that was $100,000 grant. When we got that, I mean, I was young then. I didn't have white hair.
He'll give it to us.
But when we started that, I quickly realized that there's no way that we could sustain it beyond the grant unless we did something. We charged somebody. The towns, of course, you go to a town and say, "Yeah, we'd like you to pay us this much to run your systems." They would have said, "Go pound sand. It's not in our budget." We had to wait for budget cycles. We'd never get it off the ground. So that's when we established a fairly minimal fee at first. I think it was $25 a system. So most of the operators, they didn't mind that. Well, at first they did. They said, "This is ridiculous. What's this going to get us?" After a while, they realized that if Mary Smith threw them off the property and said, "I don't want to do this anymore," we were knocking on Mary Smith's door saying, "You don't have a contract. You're out of compliance. This is the fine if you pursue." They would generally, 99% of the time, call back that same contractor because they just threw them off because they didn't want to pay it. They didn't want to maintain their system. It wasn't that he was terrible or she was terrible. It's just they didn't want to do it. So the initial grant was $100,000. And then very quickly, when we established that fee, it paid for itself. And right now it has money in the bank, which is how we are taking the next step of funding, subsidizing some of the maintenance for people who can't afford it, but also for people who we want to know what the real performance of the system is. For instance, right now, Nitro has us do all of their systems. And that's third-party data. They can't impact that at all. That has a value to a contract or company because they say, "Look, state, this isn't our data. This was collected by a third party." And we've sort of marketed that way because, we're always looking for money.
So what?
It does take you one step removed for that, which is interesting.
No, it's a nice way
I will say, yeah. So here in Connecticut, right, at least for the underground injection control program at Deep, we've got, in the ballpark of say 350, 400 systems systems. And I would say probably 75–80% of them are in significant noncompliance for similar things like you're talking about now, which is the non-submittal of reports. It's violations of not submitting your audit. I mean, we traditionally, and I've only been with the program a couple of years now, historically have not had an compliance and enforcement arm that was very large, which is something we're looking to ramp up now because we're running into a similar situation where there's just no data for us to be able to really look at these things. And so here in Connecticut, we do have watershed plans that exist at the state level, but they are very focused on surface water.
Yeah.
Right, stormwater runoff and impervious surface and those sort of things. I don't think it would be a huge leap to expand that into groundwater controls because they're all connected here.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
So George, what if Connecticut wanted to, I'll say, work with you or get access to something like this instead of developing it 100% on our own? Is there a mechanism or a way forward?
I could look into it. I mean, that's really what happened with some towns way off Cape, which said, you know, we don't want to track this stuff. You guys do it already. You know, we would definitely, there were times we'd just say, take the program, take it, you know,
Yeah.
but they'd say, we don't even want to do that part.
Yeah.
So we say, okay, here's what it costs you nothing really, because we're charging the contractors. And again, like I said, the contractors at first in a new area, they get real ticked off. They say, this is just money for nothing until somebody throws them off their property. And as soon as that happens and an enforcement arm comes in and makes them do what they need to do, now that guy or gal has not lost their job. They're back on that same site. Hello, Mrs. Smith. Nice to see you again.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll charge $60 and we'll keep 10 and give you 50. How's that for a start? And remember,
Yes,
our
spoken like a
nitrogen,
true negotiator.
yeah. And remember, you're downstream of our nitrogen mess, so it kind
Yeah.
of behooves your clamps.
Yeah, I could ask exactly what it would take if Connecticut would be interested in. We initially, there was a company that we started off with, and we found that it just didn't have the flexibility for us. So we got our own, and we have some very good programmers here, and then we sub it out to some contractors under different grants, and we've polished it up to the point where it's pretty much turnkey. So I'll find out how far it's gone down that road that we could just say, you know, if you'd like to avail yourself to it, take it on yourself. Or if, you know, you want to hand off at some point. In each of the towns we went to and we said we'd do this for them, they said, we want to do our own. We said, that's fine. Why don't we get you off the ground to the point where we can hand it off to you? And every time we came around to that date when they said they wanted the handoff, they said, no thanks. You keep doing it. What's it going to cost us? We said, nothing. Never cost you anything anyhow. So, yeah,
Well, that'd be great. Thank you. Mark and then Jim. Still got a question, Mark?
Quick question for you. This has been great, George. It's actually been very interesting. I probably missed it at the front. I got here a little late on the sampling side, and I'm coming back to the O&M because really, when somebody looks at total project cost, that's really what you're selling. Total project. Right. You know, so on the sampling side, how often are you looking that you're requiring your samplings? At once, twice a year for the data?
For that, the approvals issued to the state really tell us, but the locals often require more. Quarterly for the first 2 years.
Right.
But we know that if these are going to be part of a watershed plan, what we would like to do is take the data and try to develop the statistical way of being able to say, this is how many you need to do, and this is how frequently, and it would be a lot less than quarterly per year. Excuse me just a second. Next door. the next building. Yeah. Where those are samples going in.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So what we've done and what New York initially did, they looked at what Massachusetts required. And it was 4 tons a year for the first 2 years. But in context of a watershed plan, you don't cost people that much money. Because the primary thing when somebody goes to their site, that's travel time. You get an hour in anyhow. So
Mhm.
you're charging such and such an hour, and they're taking samples, they're running to a lab, and then each lab set is going to cost
It's
at least
$225 for a set.
Yeah, right. Depending on what you analyze
Yeah.
for.
Yep.
So what we'd like to do, and what I've been using, in fact, I just talked to somebody this morning about it, taking certain data sets and saying, look, this is how much we think you really need to sample to find out what's going on. You don't have to sample every system because DEP initially said, oh, once a month, every system. Well, that's crazy, once a month. So we have the project that we just completed at Schubel, and we sample once a month for 2 years. So now what we're going to do is go into that data set and said, let's do some, Monte Carlo here and say, what if we only sampled half of those systems once a year? What would the result would be? Would it be different than what we project with the monthly sample for 2 years? Where can we cut back and where do those two meet the same conclusion? So
Mhm.
we've got a lot of data to play with. And I just asked somebody this morning, what systems do we have more than 10 samples on over the last 2 years so that we could play that same game? We could say, okay, here's the conclusion with all the data. We would say, this is your load. Now let's pare it back and do a Monte Carlo in there and say, what if I sampled these systems only once a year? Would I come to a different conclusion? And you do 1,000 runs like that and say, okay, you would have come to the same conclusion. So why go through the once a month for every system? So I think that statistics can help us. You can also lie with statistics. I remember that book. Uh, and but I think there's a reasonable number you could get to get at the question you're asking. If the question you're asking is how these perform, you could do it with a lot less samples than I think would be once a month.
I
Would
agree.
be
George, is there any thought towards some of the other analytical methods instead of going to the lab? Have you done any work on that?
We haven't done it yet, but it's really getting pushed by us because we're going to have in our town somewhere around 3,000 IA systems. We're going to have to manage them. We're going to have to monitor them. And we don't want to charge people a lot of money when like right now, unfortunately, they have to do BOD TSS on these 2 systems I'm thinking about. I have personally never seen after 6 months a BOD less than, more than 20. And yet I'm going to keep doing that. Those BOD tests and TSS tests are expensive, the BOD in particular. But if I could do, one total nitrogen test, we're looking at maybe doing a total nitrogen combustion because that's a single test rather than TKN plus nitrite, things like that. We are looking into it because we're going to have to.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
some of that data seems to be, I mean, you do some of my systems that way and
Yes,
it's uncanny how accurate it is.
the correlation is pretty good. A TN versus nitrate and nitrite, TKN.
Agreed.
Some of them are spot on. So maybe
Um,
You
you
have
do
to
that.
use methods under, oh, sorry, do you have to use methods under 40 CFR 136?
Yes. But here at the test center, we often do, as Dave mentioned, he does some research here. We do the Hawk method. It's a digestion method for nitrogen, so it's valid.
Yeah.
40, 30-minute digestion. So we've found that those are pretty right on. And the clients that we use it for, which are right now about 8 clients that use it. They send them to the lab also, but they know the correlation, and then they'll say, okay, for the next 2 months, just run our stuff at your lab, which is, we'll probably be certified for nitrogen here as we go forward with the Gates Foundation work. But right now, we're not certified.
Jim, you got a question?
Yeah, thanks, George. I'm the only layman here, I think, and so I'll be asking a layman question. How does Massachusetts determine what's a nitrogen sensitive area? Is it based on a formula? Is it based on a map?
Okay, there's 2 nitrogen sensitive areas in Massachusetts right now. One is drinking water wells. Public wells have a zone 2 that's designated. That's the area from which they're drawing fresh water for their drinking water purpose, public drinking water. That zone 2 is on a map, and every parcel is on that same map. So you can tell, okay, that parcel's not in the zone 2. And the other nitrogen sensitive area is defined by the watershed demarcation of an impacted embayment. So we have Green Pond, for instance. It's a big pond, a lot of boats, a lot of people live around it, but the watershed goes up a half a mile at least. Some of it goes up a couple miles. So any drop of water that you drop there will get into that embayment inside that watershed. So that's, if there's a TMDL that says, look, this is an impaired watershed already, we know it's impaired. There's fish kills, there's cyanobacteria, even marine cyanos. And they said this is a nitrogen sensitive area. For the Commonwealth, it's only those areas that EPA has agreed that is the TMDL. It's been properly vetted, it's been properly determined, and the map is here. Once that map comes out, that's a nitrogen sensitive area, of which there are probably about 20 on the Cape. 14 of them are in my town. And that's again because we don't have a whole lot of tidal flushing at a 2.5 foot tidal and a lot of choked little, culverts that feed these ponds back there.
Is that revisited from time to time?
Yes, it's revisited. It's sort of revisited as the town takes its mitigation. They look at what happens in the sentinel stations that I mentioned earlier. Those are stations that are supposed to be the environmental indicators, the canaries in the mine. And if those are showing significant improvement that was predicted by the model, they say, oh, you're on the right track. If they're doing much better, they say, maybe you don't have to sewer that particular area that's on your plan, or maybe you can not put in those 50 IA systems. So it's an iterative process. But initially, it's based on that model.
Here in Connecticut, we've got the Water Quality Group, which is in a different bureau than I'm in, has a water quality classification map. And I can send a link to that through email to this folks here, but it has groundwater and surface water classifications. Yukon Clear, in partnership with Deep, just came out with a map primarily for solar purposes, but it really just lays all of our different types of GIS layers together. So you can see them all together. So land use, land masses, groundwater, surface water, watersheds. It's pretty neat. And I'll send that link out to everybody because it just went live not too long ago.
Yeah.
The driving factor in Connecticut for nitrogen is the Long Island Sound TMDL that's been in place since the 90s, maybe.
Right.
And in that, there are already established waste load allocations for towns and communities to meet by zones. That's been in place for a long time now.
Okay, so that's your driving force there, are those Long Island Sound TMDL and the assignments that have been given to each of the watersheds.
Yep.
Yeah. The only other nitrogen sensitive area by definition in our state is if you have a well and a septic system on the same parcel. that is by definition nitrogen sensitive and must not exceed 440 gallons of wastewater per acre. So 4 bedrooms an acre.
Any more questions from the group? Well, thank you, George. We'll probably all digest it, talk about it a little bit more. Maybe in a month or so, maybe we could circle back with you for some follow-up.
Yeah, and I'll look into the transferability of our sort of system of accounting here as far as the IA systems, tracking the performance and the contracts and things like that. See how transferable it is. And I know that there's some states that actually said they were going to do it. They were using that vendor I mentioned earlier. I think Florida used it for a while. We just didn't find it flexible enough simply because we're always in the weeds. There's 350 communities up here. Each has their own board of health, and every one of them has a different patch of weeds they go into, but we're generally right in there with them.
No, the other commercial systems I've seen, the town, some of them started using them and a lot of them have abandoned it. So
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing we found that you kind of look at ease and sustainability. If you've got to input data, uh, every data, big file worth of data, it's just not going to happen because there's too little resources out there to do something like that. So we found that it's better to let the vendor do it and then develop the algorithms to tell you whether they're doing it right.
yeah.
And I always say I always have artificial intelligence myself because I'm artificially intelligent. But we just say, okay, just as I said, we'd see samples come in on the same day with the same exact result. We'd see the same result reported 3 successive times. And, we know based on all the data that the probability of that is pretty low. And then when we question them, it's usually, my data input person was sick that day and I tried to do it, made a mistake. Okay, but, the first filter, you might see 1,000 data points, and it's usually wheedled down to about 600 good data points. Everything's reported. And then we do some audits. We call laboratories and say, did they bring these samples in? Because they're reporting there in the Commonwealth, you have to be done in a certified laboratory or a university laboratory that has certification. Okay, glad to do it, and I'll check on that. Good luck with your efforts here at the beginning part of it. It's always a steep climb, but there are a lot of people who climb that hill before you, so.
Well, we want to follow. We don't necessarily want to lead. It's a little easier.
Yeah, you get less bruises.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Hey, you're welcome.
All right. We'll see you later.
Take it easy.
So
George,
what does the
thank
group
you.
want
Great
to do
information.
in terms of when do we want to have another meeting?
We can we can try to flesh that out now, or David, you and I can kind of come up with some dates offline and do it that way. It's up to you.
No, that sounds fine. Let's do that. We'll come up a few, we'll shoot them around. And I guess if anybody has any thoughts on what they want to discuss next too, please let us know.
And David, I don't know if there's, obviously for other business, I didn't know if you wanted to have a conversation about, data and what this group might be looking for in order to kind of make some more broader decisions.
Yeah, I guess that's Audra's on. I don't know what ability there is to get data. I'm kind of spoiled from George's level where you could ask any question and get some really, I suppose part because the Long Island Sound is such a different issue than the watershed, the very narrow watershed approach Mass takes. We're trying to understand, the nitrogen a little more globally here because of all the inputs to what we're trying to protect. So to the extent, is it feasible, Audra, to get a high, like say the high, the low from the AT systems, the data that you have and an average, what the average would be? What's achievable?
So did you guys, so I did provide data based on the last request. Do you guys
Well,
have that? So it was of
that
the
was,
AT
that was
systems.
the question that Mark had asked.
Yeah. So we put together
Yeah.
a folder with a good amount of data in it already. So that was of like 6, maybe 7 conventional systems. And then as we've been reissuing permits at a much faster speed in the last 2 years, any system that was an AT system, we've taken all their discharge monitoring report data. And again, it's preference with that's been reported to us. And I will say most people are not reporting data. So we have massive gaps, paper, electronic, they're not doing it. And so that's like a whole different challenge to this situation is the data just doesn't exist in some places. So we are going to have gaps. We can fill those gaps in, but we've looked at them, and for a lot of our AT systems that we've re-permitted from issued permits this past year, we have found significant noncompliance with nitrogen and bacteria in the wells. So whether that's just poorly operated systems, which is very common, right? We have people who just neglect their systems. They just set it and forget it and see you later. They're not doing the audits. So we can pull together data if we know the questions that we want to answer. The Long Island Sound Fund has a lot of data, right? So the TMDL that exists for the Long Island Sound is a dissolved oxygen TMDL, but we know that the driver is nitrogen. And so when that TMDL was developed, they took the whole state, including parts of our neighboring states, and they divided it into zones. And each zone, which might include 2, 3, 4 towns, or maybe just one town, depending on the size, all had to come up with a reduction. So this is all surface water related for the most part, right? Because that's where we have the most monitoring data on. We can tell you that at this point, every lake in the state for the most part has some sort of algal bloom issue come the warmer months that we're seeing routinely. Bacteria we see with states having to close down swimming areas. That's pretty routine at this point. I mean, there are some areas that are just closed permanently. So I think if we can narrow down and figure out what questions we're looking to answer, we can target where to pull that data from.
I think we were predominantly focused on the nitrogen. I think that was
Right.
our task. So we're more or less sticking to that. And from a septic system perspective, I mean, I've seen all the data. We've done all the studies with George. Connecticut looks at it as a travel time. They in Mass they look at it more feet of material that the water moves through. So but
Yep.
I don't know that that's really where this group can go. And the lakes, I mean, presumably that's predominantly a phosphorus issue. So again, that's not really our focus. But I was not smart enough to open up your file or get it to work, which is
Hey,
probably.
Dave, you're not the only one. I couldn't do it either.
I couldn't either.
Yeah.
Guys,
I had all sorts of
I
trouble.
am not the benchmark. I'll assure it. Stu has to help me when somebody raises their hand.
so it's just a shared file. So when you open it, there should just be spreadsheets of all those systems. So
When I try to open the
It
file,
had you
it-
actually do something with Microsoft email accounts
yeah,
and
the
stuff
whole
like that.
thing.
So it's not from our end. It's not intuitive by any means.
We had to
Okay, I
request
can send the link.
permissions.
Yeah, so you just request it and then it sends me a link and then I give you access to the folder. It's just a security feature for websites.
I couldn't even
Well,
get to
and-
that.
I'm happy to spend some time to walk through folks just to open it. I'm sorry to hear that you guys haven't looked at it yet. I mean, our team spent a good amount of time pulling all that information together. at the
I
request.
suspect you did, Audra, and we appreciate that. It's
Yeah.
just we're all a bunch of old engineers. I hate to say it.
Yeah. Yeah, we spend more time than you'd suspect, probably. But if we could get access to that, I think that's helpful. But, trying to understand the broad, really the broad implications so we can bear down on some of these details with better, I guess, clarity is what we're hoping.
Yeah, I mean, for the AT systems that exist, so like you guys probably all know, right, there's a general permit that exists, right? And the general permit for on-site systems is really primarily geared at conventional systems. Very few of those have requirements for monitoring, groundwater monitoring. The rest of the individual permits that we issue are for AT systems. So we do have data, but a lot of it is in paper form. And again, the last probably dozen permits that we've reissued that have been those kind of like legacy permits, they've all been in non-compliance for nitrogen in some way or another. And so I don't think it's going to show you the AT systems are operating like they're supposed to be, but I don't think that's a failure of the system. I think it's a failure of a lot of variables that go into that.
I don't think anyone has any, I mean, based on what I see around the country, I'd be surprised if they did. But it's just trying to understand what it is so that we can help, I guess, advise the legislature on what might make sense.
Yeah. So I think it's systemic, right? I think it's a systemic issue that really has a lot of variables and parts, right? We have programs that are not funded. They don't have resources. And so we could go, I could take I have 3 people on staff, 2 are brand new, are younger professionals, right? So they're still kind of learning. But we don't have the resources to go after each one of those. The programs that are set up today are just, kind of band-aids, I think, for the last 20 years or so. And I think probably the health department's seeing the same thing. What we just heard George talk about sounds like, a well thought out, planned and funded program, right? Soup to nuts, beginning to end.
Well, and the most important thing, and George is a very practical guy. He's a great scientist, he's a very practical guy. You go anywhere on Cape Cod and people respect him. He's a regulator that tried to help people get things done. And that brought a lot of respect. So that process where the permit, but basically the owner is paying for that ability to electronically file, whether it's through his operator or not, that's a really solid program. And he knows that Long Island's program where they just get free money is not sustainable, right? That's not going to go forever. So
it's not. We have a system in place. So in our surface water world, for surface water discharges under the NIPTES program, the systems are already in place to do electronic reporting. We've already reached out to many of our folks in the underground injection control world to switch them over. As you can imagine, we got a lot of hesitation with no, we don't want to do that. And so, but we have a lot of the tools, it sounds like, in place in other programs in the agency that just aren't funded by UIC specifically. And so there's transferable things that can definitely happen, right? And we could modernize programs left, right, and center, but it does take kind of that well thought out plan of like, what are we really trying to get after here? To really be able to take, my 3 staff people, and then whoever, the health department's got 1 or 2 folks in each of those programs, right? To figure out what it is we're really going after. It definitely can be done, but I think it's just been so fragmented for so many years that everybody's just trying to band-aid and then continue to band-aid, right? That's what, some of this is like, we're trying to fix the problem, but we don't have a solid foundation for these programs.
Yeah, and the consistency, what we have on the Cape, this George has been consistent since the 80s. So
that's impressive. I want to go look at his data.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go
well, and the neat thing is
impressive.
that then we could compare data from all areas in the Northeast, right? And make better decisions on what technologies will help us. But it seems to me until we figure out a way to manage data, I don't know how we develop a system to treat nitrogen. It's the foundation of everything we're going to do.
So there is likely a lot of information available. And when we're done here, I can go talk to our watershed folks because we have an entire watershed team, right? Water quality folks, they do a bunch of stuff. They have a lot of data. They've been working on a statewide model with the Long Island Sound Fund for many, many years. And so there is a lot of information out there that we might be able to leverage. You know, if we're looking to figure out, you know, what are the nitrogen targets, right? So George talked about watersheds. We already have watersheds delineated here in the state. It is very likely the surface water and the groundwater watershed are going to be the same. Those are narrowed down. We must have 7,000 like sub tiny watersheds in the state. All those things have already been done. I think it's just learning about those, right, and putting it all on paper. And then taking some of the surface water components and say, okay, we need to answer the same question, but for groundwater, right? And again, we might have that. It's just with a different program somewhere else. That might help fill in some of the gaps.
Would those folks be inclined to maybe, give us a short presentation or do something similar to what George did today and just have a conversation with us?
They may. I'm going to preface it with they retire in December. The supervisor retires. So Tracy Ayat, who's been here, she retires in February. And then Carol Papp, or not Carol Papp, Rose has been here for quite some time, 30, 40 years or so. So I think there's definitely stuff out there. I don't know how much capacity they would have at this point to bring it full circle. So again, I think if we can come up with a list of questions, I can go throw that in front of them during one of my monthly meetings and see if I can get some answers out of them faster. And I'm happy to share the information and the resources. Yeah, I'm already putting together an email now with some maps you guys can take a look at where some of the stuff is already located. Back in 2015, the programs put together town, they call them fact sheets. So it was essentially like looking at each town and saying, okay, what does your watershed look like? What's your population? What's your impervious surface? You know, it was taking all these pieces together. So we're working to modernize that today to put it into story maps for the towns based on data they provided from their MS4 annual reports. But not every town is an MS4 community. So it won't have all of the information, but it will be telling. It really is just trying to figure out like what is the sole questions, and then we can figure out where to pull data from. We are very data happy here at the state for sure. We just need to know what we're pulling.
David, I think we're like well beyond the hour and a half allotted time I think we had for this.
Yeah, agreed.
We'll get back to folks about the next date and time for this subcommittee to meet. We do have our larger working group meeting today at 2:00, and hope to see y'all there. But David, if you have any final last words, if not, then we can wrap the meeting up for the day.
No, enough words for one day, but thank you all for taking the time. And if you think of anything, any questions too in topics for the next meeting, let us know.
Great.
All right, thanks.
Sure. Thanks
See
for
y'all
bringing
later.
in George.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Thank
We'll
you.
get George back if we need to. All right, thanks. See y'all.
Yeah. Feel like a field trip. Bye.
You're welcome. We can all go up there if that's helpful. I'm sure you'd be happy to